will half for Q&A. So I might think it's shorter than that. Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session, which promises to throw up a lot of interesting issues and have a direct resonance, shall we say, flowing from the recent state assembly elections. Since Jay is familiar with many of the issues that have cropped up, and he's written about the Gilded Age, which is a subject before us, I'm sure we will get a set of stimulating ideas which will provoke questions. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with Mr. Panda, but very briefly to recap, for those who may not be fully aware of his background, he is now a member of the Lok Sabha from the Biju Janata Dal, representing Kendrapada in Orissa. And before that he was in the Rajya Sabha he didn't finish the second term, and then he jumped into the Lok Sabha election process. He has a business background. His family's been running a business for decades. They've had a long relationship with the Patnaik family over the years, and Jay himself was running the business, and then before that went to the US for education, doing both technology and management. And as he says, at some point in discussing industry issues in various CII forums, got involved in larger policy issues and got sucked into politics. He really represents the kind of clean new face in Indian politics that you welcome, and you hope will bring about the changes that we look forward to. So without further ado, Jay, all yours.
Thank you, Nanan. There are really only two kinds of politicians. The first kind can speak nonsense about any subject under the sun, and the second kind doesn't need a subject. I guess I'll have to wait until the end of this session for you to figure out which kind I am. But I'm a little hesitant because I see many people here who likely know much more about the Gilded Age than I do. I'm not a historian, not a journalist. I'm an engineer and a management professional who's had a mid-career change into politics. I define myself as an accidental politician. And the reason for that is that I had not planned to be in politics. It was circumstances, and essentially the circumstances were that when I came back to the country after some years abroad, it was very frustrating to deal with the bureaucracy, the red tape. This was in the 90s, and I'd complain about it all the time, and my friends eventually told me to either shut up or to do something about it. And one thing led to another, and here I am. The theme of what I'd like to say today is essentially that we must look at the bigger picture of what's happening in India. And often I think the national dialogue gets mired so much in current events that we lose sight of the bigger picture. Another aspect I'd like to touch upon, and this is where the Gilded Age comes in, is the uncanny similarity to what the US went through in the second half of the 19th century and the first few years, the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And it has been commented on by other commentators, but from a political perspective, I think there are real lessons that we can draw. It's not my case that we should emulate the US blindly. In fact, we shouldn't. I think there are many things that we should learn not to do. But I think the sense of déjà vu that one gets in looking at the US history of that period and Indian history presently being made is uncanny. And the third and the main point I wish to make is that we have a very sharply rising middle class in terms of numbers. And the hypothesis is that is it reaching a tipping point where it makes a fundamental difference to the way India is governed? And my hypothesis is that yes, it is. And that's what I'd like to examine. A lot of people in India would instantly recognize the name of A. Raja. Not that many, although I suspect there are some exceptions in this room, not that many would recognize the name of Albert Fall. The first American cabinet member to be jailed for corruption happened in 1929. But the story actually begins much before that. What is referred to as the Gilded Age in America is the period which is the post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction period in the second half of the 19th century until the end of the 19th century. But you can't speak of the Gilded Age by itself. May I request you to turn off your phones, please? Or at least put them on silent. But you can't speak of the Gilded Age without speaking of the time that followed it, which was the Progressive Era, which was the first 2 decades of the 20th century. But the Gilded Age was the last 3 decades or so of the 19th century, where the US had phenomenally high growth rates, economic growth rates. And that's what we are experiencing for the last 2 decades. In the last 3 decades of the 19th century, the US had its highest ever growth rates. Let me give you some sample numbers. In the 1870s and 1880s was this peak period. But between 1865 and 1898, output of wheat went up by more than 250%, 30-year period. Output of corn, nearly 250%. Output of coal, 800% in 30 years. The miles of railway track installed went up by more than 550%. By the beginning of the 20th century, the US had the highest per capita income in the world. It had a per capita income of twice that of Germany and France, and 1.5 times of the UK. This is quite stunning if you think about it, because it started the century, the 19th century, and throughout most of the century, it was primarily an agricultural country, just like we are today. Something like 80% of Americans made their livelihoods from farming. Pretty much what we've been going through. I think we are now a little less than, we are something like 65% of Indians today make a livelihood of some kind from farming. This phenomenal surge of economic growth was not necessarily equitable. In fact, you had income disparities increase quite a bit, but eventually it led to something that's remarkable, because by the 20th century, the majority of Americans described themselves as middle class, which was not the case in the middle of the 19th century. But those few decades leading up into the first third of the 20th century or so led to the majority of Americans describing themselves as middle class. Again, striking similarities. We have this sharply rising numbers of Indian middle class. When I say that the income disparities grew and the growth was not equitable, it again brings about a sense of déjà vu, because that's a debate we have in this country. Inclusive growth. Now, how you achieve inclusive growth, whether you achieve it or not, is a matter for another day. But growth per se is important. You had the second half of the 19th century see the growth of what are described as the robber barons. The first generations of American billionaires most of them, many of them, immigrants, not all of them. People who in one generation went from, starting out to running humongous industrial empires. Names like Carnegie, Morgan, Mellon, Vanderbilt, Astor. Again, striking similarities with India. If you look at the India of 20 years ago, the pecking order in the wealthy had not changed much over decades. You had business families that had been around for a century and a half, and they dominated the top 20 or the top 50 with some changes. But if you look at the last 20 years, particularly the last 10 years, you've got these large numbers of Indian millionaires and billionaires, many of them now reaching out across the world. Something else I'd like to also talk about. Now, there's an angle connected with the first generation US billionaires, which I will touch upon a little later, which is philanthropy. But I'll come to that later. Another thing that's striking is that until the middle of the 19th century, if you look at the behavior in American legislatures, particularly Congress, Senate, striking similarities. In fact, much worse than what we have in India today. You had people have wrestling matches on the floor of the Senate and the Congress. You had people take out their batons and whips, members, against each other. They threw spittoons. Of course, they had duels, which we don't have. What changed? Now, this is documented. I'm not making this stuff up. What changed? Now, you have different hypotheses. The major thing that changed, of course, is that the country became middle class. And middle class values began to count. Middle class values do not support the kind of people that would throw spittoons and scuffle and disrupt legislatures. That had a direct impact into the couple of decades that followed the Gilded Age, which is the progressive era, and I'll come to that in a bit. So the progressive era essentially is a period of about not 2 but 3 decades, from the last decade of the 19th century till the 20s. And the case that I mentioned about Albert Fall, the first cabinet member, who was accused of $500,000 of bribery, was actually pinned down on $100,000. The other $400,000 couldn't be proven, but he did go to jail. And that was at the very end of the progressive era, by which time a lot of changes had happened. The progressive era consisted of people a bit like Anna Hazare. I'm not a historian, and there might be other people who could actually identify the figures that led this, but it involved a large number of people, many of them moralists like Anna Hazare, who started campaigns for change in public life. And let me give you an example of the similarity. While Anna Hazare has got a lot of support from civil society, there have been some criticisms about the sort of lack of democratic fashion in which he's been spearheading this change, this campaign against corruption. Also, if you look at his track record, the model village that Anna Hazare has championed has seen instances where his supporters have tied drunkards to trees and beaten the crap out of them. Fascism, you might say, but moralism is what some people would say. And in fact, the progressive era led to prohibition, which was later repealed. But you can see the similarities, that you have a group of moralists who brought about campaigns that led to change. Prohibition may have been repealed, but there have been a large number of lasting changes that the progressives brought around. Let me mention 2 of them. Before the progressive era, the Senate in America used to be elected just like our Rajya Sabha from the state assemblies. Our Rajya Sabha is elected from the state assemblies. The Senate was not directly elected from the people. It was elected from the state legislatures in the US. What does that lead to? Now, anybody that's familiar with Indian politics can tell you that essentially it's not an election, it's a party nomination. Once you've secured the party nomination, you have pretty much clinched your seat in the Rajya Sabha. There's a party oligarchy. It could be a family, it could be a small group, which essentially decides who the nominees are going to be and who will represent a large state, maybe 80 million people, maybe 100 million people. And that's what it was. You had these party bosses. That's what they were called. They were called bosses in the US, who controlled the parties. One of the major changes that the progressives brought around was the 17th Amendment to the US Constitution, which then required that the Senate be directly elected from the people. So what that does is it takes out the grip of a small oligarchy of politicians. It then becomes much more democratic, where the public has to elect not just the lower house, but also the upper house. Now, I've argued about this, in favor of this, in some of my newspaper columns. Some of my fellow politicians have criticized me. They've said that we already have too much democracy. We need to be a little bit like China. We'll do better if we have a little less democracy. I don't agree. I don't agree at all. I think what we need is more democracy, and I'll tell you why. When you have the kind of democracy that we have, and I like it, I think it just needs tweaking, it needs improving. I don't think it needs throwing out. But what you have is a system where a leader or a group or a party with a fairly small support base can hold the country's policies to ransom or the state's policies hostage. Also, you cater to the lowest common denominator. If you are assured that in a state of 100 million people, you get the vote of 10 or 12 million people and you get a certain number of seats, and you can hold the system hostage. Whereas if you have to appeal to the entire 100 million people of your state, you'll have to broad base your appeal. Very hard to appeal to just Dalits or just OBCs if you need to win the entire state. And I think that's what we need. I think we need tweaking of our political system, which structures incentives for politicians to appeal to the largest number of Indians instead of small compartments of Indians who would then give them the leverage to hold the system to ransom. Another major legislative change that the progressives brought about is they changed the fundamental way that parties nominated their candidates. Now, just by having elections to the Senate, the parties had to still choose the most viable candidate who would win from the public, but you still had bosses who could decide who should be the candidate. But the progressives brought about changes in the state legislatures and state laws, which required that parties have primary elections. Now, again, anybody who's familiar with Indian politics knows that one of the biggest problems is that we do not have internal democracy in most Indian parties. And that often leads to not the best candidates coming out, for whatever reason. Now, there are arguments against primaries. You know how difficult elections are to hold in India. So if you have open primaries, they'll be expensive, they'll be complicated, it'll involve all kinds of law and order machineries to be in place. Yes, that's true, but I think we will need to progress in that direction if we are to really get the advantage of being a democracy, of being the largest democracy in the world. Only if we can have internal party democracy, truly, not just in form, but in substance, I think parties will start throwing up candidates that will truly be able to make a difference, rather than parties throwing up candidates that are towing the party line entirely. We've had legislative changes in India that have in fact accentuated this problem of candidates having to toe the party line. Over the past decade that I've been in Parliament, we've made amendments. For example, the anti-defection law was well intentioned because you had horse trading where MPs would trade their votes. But we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater in some sense, because we've made an enormous number of parliamentary actions come under the party whip. In other words, Today, a member of parliament has much less freedom to exercise his or her own conscience. Because if you don't follow the party whip, you are eligible for losing your membership of parliament. And what the progressives have done, or did, a century ago, was the reverse trend, to break the grip of the party bosses and to enforce much more internal party democracy. And may I request phones to be switched off, please? And that, I think, is something that is beginning to happen in this Anna Hazare campaign, in the public reaction, in the elections that you have seen, is a feeling that we need to break some of the systems that operate in Indian politics today. Let me share with you an anecdote I have about the feelings that most people have about politicians. The joke is that a plane full of politicians crashes, and it takes a few hours for the rescuers to arrive. And when they arrive, they find a few farmers, but no survivors, no dead bodies, nothing. So they asked the farmers, what happened to the passengers? And the farmer said, oh, I buried them all. And he said, but weren't any of them alive? And the farmer said, yes, some of them kept insisting they were, but you know what damn liars these politicians are. That is essentially the Indian public's mood today about politicians. Bury them all. And I think that's funny, we must take it in the right spirit. But I think that's misplaced. I think we need to cure them. I think we need to improve the system, not bury them all, not throw out the baby with the bathwater. So I'll come to my conclusion. The big picture. The big picture is this, that whichever way you look at India, more Indians are better off today than they were before. I'm not saying it's ideal. I'm not saying we should condone corruption that we've seen. Yes, it might have been better, might have been finer tuned. But if you're not looking for the ideal, if you're looking to compare absolutes, are more Indians better off today than they were before? My answer is absolutely yes. If you look at the political system, it has empowered hundreds of millions of Indians, particularly of the lower castes, who simply did not have a voice, and today they do. Is our political system perfect? No, as I've just explained, it isn't, and we need to bring about changes to improve it. But it has improved the lives of very large numbers of Indians. What about economic growth? Again, I put it to you that any way you look at it, you can use your own metrics. You can define what is poverty, you can define what is being well off, you can define your parameters for what is the middle class. You know, people disagree about the size of the Indian middle class, but use your own parameters and apply it consistently over the last 20 years. And absolutely you will find, if you use the same consistent parameters, that the size of the middle class has grown enormously in the last 20 years. Yes, there are still a large number of Indians that are in crippling poverty. Yes, income disparity has increased. But if you look at, for example, The Economist just 2 weeks ago published a countrywide analysis, country by country international analysis of income disparities. India is not the best, but it is very far from the worst. India is much better off than countries like Brazil, countries like China. There are disparities, but if you compare how much wealth is hogged by the top 20% compared to how much wealth or poverty is shared by the bottom 20%, India is about average. I'm sure we can improve this, but when we bemoan our situation, we shouldn't lose sight of perspective. We shouldn't lose sight of the big picture. So in conclusion, I come to the point that the middle class is coming to a tipping point. Now, politicians have given short shrift to the middle class. They've always treated the middle class as pretty much irrelevant. The numbers had been very small, and in any case, they were not politically active. We have a sort of a reverse situation. Again, if you compare to the developed Western countries, you'll find that those who describe themselves as middle class in the US, for instance, or Canada, have a higher turnout at election times. And those who are the underprivileged, the underclass, inner city poor, have a lower turnout. Special efforts have to be made to get them out to vote by the parties that would benefit from them. In India, it's just the reverse. You have much lower turnouts at election time by the middle class, and much higher turnouts by those who've suffered the most, the underclass, if you will, who see it as their one chance to teach a lesson to those rascals. But the middle class is now coming of age, if you will. The numbers certainly are getting there. I don't know whether these instances of campaigns for corruption indicate that these people will actually turn out to vote. I don't know, but if they do, they could make significant differences in certain urban votes, in urban constituencies. Out of the 543 total Lok Sabha members, Lok Sabha seats, I seem to remember at the last election in 2009, there was an analysis that was printed that something like 80 could be swung in urban areas if the middle class actually put their money where their mouth is, if they went out and voted. We can revisit these numbers, but it is certainly true that the middle class is getting involved in campaigns, not just the corruption campaign, certain other campaigns, the Jessica Lal murder case, for instance, few others. But more than that, they have clout far beyond their numbers. The middle class punches well above its weight class. Simple reason is, the middle class in India today is reaching a point where its spending, its disposable income is substantial. It's larger than many countries, most countries actually. And what that means is, it compels media attention. Media is going to be focused on middle class interests. That's where the money is. And that is where they punch above their class and can have a disproportionate effect on policy making. Are we at that point? I think if we aren't yet, we are on the verge of it. It could happen in the next election or the one after that. But certainly the trends indicate that we are getting there. And if we are getting there, what does that mean? It means that middle class values will be given importance by politicians. Unruly behavior in parliament will not be rewarded. That doesn't gel with middle class values. Does that mean an important change in how we govern ourselves? I think it does. That's just a sort of a superficial example of how politicians might and perhaps will reorient their behavior. But there are deeper issues of policy. And time doesn't permit me to go into all of that, but I'll be happy to address any of those issues in question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. We now go into question answer mode, and we will have about 45 minutes of it. Your comments will raise a lot of sort of thoughts about a whole range of issues. And before I just recognize that people who put up their hands already, I want to sort of use my prerogative here to be here with the mic to ask you an initial question, which is, are you in any sense suggesting any kind of inevitability about moving from a Gilded Age to a progressive age? And if not, then if it's not inevitable, then what are the issues or factors that you need to keep in mind or take into account or deal with to make sure that the system gets reformed broadly along the lines that you would approve?
That's a very good question. And the candid answer is no, it's not inevitable. We could certainly derail. And if the middle class engagement with issues is fleeting, or if the middle class gets disenchanted with the rate of success, because it's not going to be a quick process, it's a slow process, then I think we stand the risk that these changes will not happen. Nothing is inevitable. But there is tremendous momentum in the growth of the middle class. And I think that politicians, being fairly shrewd people, will recognize that. Let me give one more example from the progressive era. There were many figures who were not in politics or who were at state level politics who were at the forefront. But after a while, national level politicians got in on the act. Some of the state level changes preceded the national level acts. And let me give you two examples in India. In India, the issue of corruption and good governance has actually been more important in regional politics. In my own state, in Odisha, Naveen Patnaik has won 3 elections on a campaign of anti-corruption and good governance. Nitish Kumar in Bihar has just won his 2nd election on a similar platform. There are 1 or 2 other examples I can give, but national politics hasn't yet engaged with it. If they do, it's just basically throwing mud at each other. But the example that you can take from the progressive era in the US is that a few shrewd politicians, both parties, bipartisan, both Democratic and Republican, jumped on the bandwagon, and instead of trying to score brownie points, rode the tiger on the high moral ground that they wanted systemic change. On the Republican side, you had the earlier Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, and you had Herbert Hoover. And on the Democratic side, you had Woodrow Wilson. Now, we haven't seen that change yet in India. You've seen whatever national dialogue you've seen is politicians throwing mud at each other instead of saying, you know, let's take on the bigger issue of reform. But I think sooner rather than later, you will see a few politicians who will grasp that there is more to be gained in some sort of bipartisan action rather than just mudslinging.
Okay, I may come back with some more questions later, but there are 4 people I've got, so I'll just signal the first 4 and then I'll take the rest. The gentleman here in the 3rd row, then you over here, at the back, and then over here. Those are the first 4 questions. And then we'll come to the others. If you can, for the benefit of everybody present, do please identify yourself. And I would request you to be brief and just pose a question, not make any statements.
Thank you. My name is Arindas. I'm a senior fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies Analysis. I have 2 questions relating to Mr. Panda's presentation. One is about, he referred to the anti-defection law. Well, my question is, do you feel that the present anti-defection law in its present form stifles dissent? And don't you think that, going by the experiences so far and going by the latest experience in Karnataka, don't you think that who should be the deciding authority for the cases relating to anti-defection law? Should be, right now it is the presiding officer, the chairman, the speaker or the chairman, or in the assembly again. Don't you think that supposing we have some body like the election commissioner or even the president of India, or say for example we have a system as it is in South Africa, there is a system called window period in which they allow the members to defect. They provide a window period, and then there is a time limit. If they defect, fine. If they change the party, they don't call it defects. If they change the party, it is fine. Otherwise, it's not possible. The experience so far is that it has much more been misused, this anti-defection law. That's my first question. Second question is relating now, even the Mother Parliament UK, they are going for a lot of reforms. Like latest reform, they are going for a referendum to go for post-pact system to proportional alternative system. Do you think is it possible to practice in India also? Thank you.
Okay, we'll just take 2 and then you can get back to the responses.
My name is Dipinda Sekho. I'm an entrepreneur. I have 2 questions. First question, how can the middle classes accelerate this transition from the Gilded Era to Progressive Era? What specific top few reforms would you say could be critical in this respect? And second, do you see this as a power struggle between, let's say, the progressive forces and not so progressive forces? Not so progressive forces right now being in control. would not want to get these changes through, even if all of us recognize that these are progressive changes.
Do you want to take those or taking
Has the anti-defection law been sufficient? Well, let me tell you, it's been very effective. I can tell you from personal experience that with the 2004 election, when the NDA government lost, my party was a part of the NDA. The NDA's top managers included some very competent wheeler dealers. And if it were not for anti-defection laws, it would have come back into power. The reason being that the UPA alliance was not in place. It only took place after the election. But anti-defection laws made it pretty clear that unless, if you did defect, you would actually lose your seat. I can give you several other examples that anti-defection laws have been effective. Are they fully effective? Of course not. You know that there have been cases, cash for queries and all that. But as far as anti-defection goes, that's been fairly effective. Should the presiding officer be the ultimate? Now, unfortunately, if you believe in the separation of powers in democracy, it has to be. Because if you, if you can have outside ombudsmen or that kind of a body, but essentially you have to provide the checks and balances inside each pillar. How that could happen is open to discussion. Let me tell you another thing that is very similar to what happened in the progressive era and what has been proposed by Anna Hazare. Several states passed referendum and recall laws in the early part of the 20th century. And what Anna Hazare is proposing now is that after corruption, his next target is to have a recall law. That if you get certain number of signatures in the public, you can start a referendum for recalling a member of parliament. I think that would be a wonderful thing, because that would bring about a degree of accountability that is higher than what we have today. Proportional representation, you know that thing failed in the UK. It has been voted out. I don't know whether it would work in India. It would be speculation. My view is as good as yours. So if we don't have a referendum system, we probably need to have one. That could be one of the changes that we should consider. Specific top few reforms that are necessary. I think if I had to put my bets on one single bit of reform, it would have to be enforcing intra-party democracy. Now that is actually there in form already, but not in substance, because the Election Commission is empowered today to demand intra-party elections, to demand intra-party transparency. They do so, but in a pro forma manner. Each party conducts sham elections, almost every party, and they send these sham results to the EC, and the EC accepts it. Now, our Election Commission is actually a highly effective body when it comes to real elections, national elections. So it's a shame that they haven't decided to assert themselves on party elections. So, we could have a whole list, but if I had to put my money on one thing, it would have to be that thing.
In the back, I'll come to you.
Hi, my name is Ashish Jain. I had a question, Jay. You talk about middle class values being very important as a driving force for change in our society. So my question is, like, when the US moved from the Gilded Age to the progressive era, did the middle class actually enter politics themselves? Because I would imagine a person with a middle class background would be probably a more effective repository of middle class values than someone who's not from a middle class background. And if that's the case, is it, like in India, is it like a viable career given kind of the pay scales and the options a middle class person would normally have? So yeah, I just wanted to get your views on that.
Over here. Yeah, I recognize it. I know there are lots of hands going up. I'll try and do it in sequence and be as fair as possible.
Thank you. My name is Pankaj. I work with GE. When you look at US and India, one thing that stands out very different is the educational system. Now, when you look at India, it's sad to know, but there are hardly any colleges, schools of learning. If you lived in any, as a normal, ordinary, middle-class Indian, in any of the cities of this country, the biggest requests and the strongest requests come for getting your children admitted to a decent school, half a decent school. Now, what are you, let's say, in your own state doing to say that the universities, schools in Odisha are the best in the world? Now, that probably would be a more fundamental difference, and if the Gilded Age, the Progressive Age, whatever age, would have come about by having higher, very good learning, education learning institutions. Thank you.
Okay.
Did the middle class actually enter politics? The interesting thing is that in American politics particularly, since we are comparing, you have low enough barriers that all kinds of people enter politics. You have the super rich enter politics and they spend their own billions. You have somebody of mixed racial parentage who was working as a social organizer, able to raise $300 million or half a billion dollars, become president of the US. The important thing is that more important than who enters politics is that people actively participate, actively engage. But of course you need reforms of election funding, and you need reforms of, for example, intra-party democracy to ensure that anybody can enter. You're right, if an average middle-class professor decided to enter politics, the chances are pretty low that he or she could make a go of it. So we need election funding reform, but you know, the root cause of all reform is held up in party democracies. And yes, some middle-class people do actually participate in politics to the extent of running for elections in the US. And I think that could also happen in India if we lower the barriers that exist. Next question about educational system. Very, very good question. The fact is that two of the consistent themes in the progressive era, besides political reform, were very fundamental educational reform and a great deal of emphasis on science and technology. Let me give you some numbers that might shock you. It was only after 1910 that the smaller cities started building adequate number of schools. And it was only in 1940 that 50% of young adults had earned a high school diploma. So it was after the end of the progressive era that you got to a stage of 50% of people, of citizens getting a high school education. So India is much behind that. But are we beginning to see some change on the educational front? I think we do. I think we are. I think today you're beginning to see a great deal of emphasis. There is some pending legislation. There is a sort of a crusading cabinet minister who's focused on educational reform. I think we might be beginning to see that kind of reform, or at least the beginnings of that. But you're right, that's extremely critical.
Okay, two people there, Mr. Kapoor and then you. And then we'll take a couple of questions from here.
Thank you. First of all, let me compliment you. It's very refreshing to listen to a politician such as yourself. My first question is the dilemma that many of us would say urban educated voters have. We can see, as you said, a lot of very rational parties whom we would like to empower. As you mentioned, somebody like Mr. Nitish Kumar, your party, maybe Gujarat, the 3 or 4 prominent cases. But sitting here in Delhi, when I look at the voter list that I have in front of me, I mean the list of candidates I have in front of me, I really don't know what to do. So it's one thing to say, yes, you must go and vote. But how do I overcome the dilemma that when I actually go to vote, there's not one rascal I'd like to vote for? So that's one. And yet, at the end of the day, I can see lots of people who I would like to vote for. So can you suggest a way out for, as I said, many of us, you already talked about the urban concentration and the fact that people in urban areas are getting far more politically aware and willing to get involved in voting. But they face this dilemma that, you know, when I go there, I'm voting for the wrong guy. The second point is, and I think this is a larger issue, is one of voter education. And ultimately, as you said, we are greatly helped by the media because whatever you might say, thanks to the media, there is a lot more voter consciousness. Now that has one negative, that you're raising voter aspirations in a large number of very poor illiterate people who do not have the educational background to satisfy those ambitions. So you are seeing rising crime, instability and all of that. How does an audience such as this help in voter education? Thank you.
Ranjan Mahapatra. Well, I have been a management consultant and a policy advisor to Government of India and many other institutions. My domain is CSR, Corporate Social Responsibility and Philanthropy. And maybe, Mr. Panda, thanks for all that you said, but I think you missed out on philanthropy. The essence of what you said about the change of changes in USA and India compared. My question is about the change in mindset of Americans when they get into middle class and they migrate out of middle class. And what is the comparison about the change of mindset of the people who get into middle class and then when they migrate? I have a hypothesis, might be right or wrong, because I am currently comparing the philanthropy and CSR culture in India versus USA, and the current Bill Gates and Warren Buffett coming into India and influencing Indian millionaires, billionaires to do more of giving and charity. Is it the fact that Indian mindset sticks to middle class and they don't grow out of middle class? Because the philanthropy and charity and the attitude to give is not essentially something which is not part of India, but it's not happening now as much as it could have happened. Your take.
About electoral choices when you go out to vote. You know, essentially every voting choice is a choice of choosing the least bad option. Let's not pretend that in America or elsewhere politicians are saints or in any way that much better than our politicians. Let me give you another anecdote. Somebody went to the polling station and looked at the list and said, "Thank God only one of these guys can get into power." Because that is essentially what politics is about. But exercising your choice for the least bad option, even if you have to hold your nose to do so, is important. Because it's engagement with the system and the process that's important. So how can you make sure that you can get to vote for the person that you like? Well, participate in campaigns that are beginning to now come up in various parts for electoral reform. There are certain NGOs that are working on this. For example, our parliamentary system begins by assuming that the MPs are not going to contribute anything useful. Because in terms of support that MPs are given, office, research, staff, etc., it's a complete pittance compared to what other established democracies have. There are now NGOs with funding from, for example, like Ford Foundation and others, who are beginning to fill the gap, who are providing research briefs, one-page notes, and which are beginning to be used by an increasing number of MPs. I have seen this happen in the last 2 years, much more than in the previous 9 years that I have been in Parliament. So you can participate in some of these activities that are going on. I'm sure many people in the middle class have gone to Jantar Mantar and supported Anna Hazare. All that's great. My appeal to you is, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Remain focused on the idea that democracy is good. In fact, it's great. We need to iron out the chinks in our system and improve it. You know, those people in the middle class who have that idea about burying all the politicians, the joke that I used, sometimes forget that non-democratic systems are actually far worse. Have you forgotten the 70 billion that the Egyptian leader is supposed to have spirited away? Do you think China doesn't have corruption? It has massive corruption. So stay engaged. Don't debunk democracy. Focus on, get involved in those issues that you want to change. Now, philanthropy, you're right. I did forget to mention. I did mention the robber barons, who ultimately, due to public pressure and perhaps their own change of mindset, contributed immensely to building up the great institutions of education in America and hospitals and so many other things. One of the numbers that Kapil Sibal constantly trots out is something very interesting. The cost of an American university education is quite high, but whatever is only 14% of that comes from student fees, from tuition fees. 86% of that comes from their endowments, from these originally from the robber barons, but many other philanthropic endowments. Now, are we there? Of course we are not there, but are we beginning to get there? You know, I think we're beginning to see the beginnings of that. For example, Warren Buffett was here a few weeks ago, and I participated in one interaction with him, and he's been going around the country and the world. You've seen the founder of Wipro just give away half his wealth, or more than half his wealth. Okay, now, it may be, you know, one swallow does not a summer make, but certainly you have at least one example. I'm sure there may be other examples. I have come across people who contribute to, you know, mid-level entrepreneurs, smaller entrepreneurs who contribute to kitchens that subsidize midday meal schemes. In Odisha itself, I have seen that happen. I think we are beginning to see change. You know, when you have a scarcity mentality, you've been a poor country, then it's very hard to have a philanthropic mindset. But if you begin to see the kind of wealth that's being created today, I think it's possible that you'll see much larger philanthropic endowments.
Okay, swinging left, 1 and 2, and then we'll come to this group here. After you, at the back, and then you.
Yeah, my name is Vidul. One lesson which you haven't picked out from the Americans is that learn how to spend a deficit. You can actually spend a deficit, you can plan a deficit, such that you don't even need to tax, there's no shortage of capital, and there's no displacement of personnel. I've actually done a PhD thesis on this, and learned that from America. They are experts at spending deficits, and even though they're the largest economy in the world, they also have the largest deficit in the world. So I don't understand why we are looking for FDI. Rather, it would be better if we invited foreign companies and gave them lines of credit in INR. That is one. The second thing is, corruption is not a political issue, it's a socio-economic evil. If there are 1,000 people and there are 400 apples, you're going to have corruption. So I don't think you have to worry about corruption until you don't solve the question of supply side, or have 1,000 apples there. Once you have 1,000 people and 1,000 apples, and then you have corruption, then you've got something to worry about. But until then, I don't think there should be a focus on that. Thank you.
I'm Colonel Ruff, development consultant. My question is that the corruption is the most. Corruption is the evil of the everything to get into from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Age. Just I wanted to ask you a question that whether to stand for the election in the member of the parliament, how much you have to spend? As I heard, it may be something like 20 to 30 crores of rupees. Can a middle class man, if he wants to enter politics, get that money to stand in the election? The entry point of many politicians, I don't want to name very poor people. I don't name a chief minister of Jharkhand who was very poor, I know him. Today, he amassed 4,000 crores and he's in the jail. So what I'm telling, most of the politicians, the entry point was the poorest, and they've treated it as a business, maybe a family business now converted to, and they've amassed wealth. And many people want to enter politics to amass wealth, except 20 to 20% who are genuinely wants to do something in the development of the country. So I want to know that how this bridge can be gapped.
The question about deficit management, you know, I'm not an economist, so I can't answer that. But I can tell you how I would respond to that. I think what is important is that there must be dialogue about this in the country. And people must vote for what they wish. And that is what democracy is all about. Now, some people would argue that FDI is good. Some people do argue that FDI is not good. I think you can draw conclusions either side, depending on you know, what examples you cite. Let me just digress a little bit on this and mention something. When I keep mentioning the middle class, I must mention an irony. You know, in India, the corruption issue has got highlighted because of the Spectrum scandal. and of course other scandals as well, but it's the telecom scandal which has really highlighted the corruption issue. And I find this ironic for one simple reason, because you saw these large number of particularly younger Indians, and mainly middle class, but also some not middle class, but mostly younger. And they went to Jantar Mantar, and they've been on the blogospheres and Twitter and Facebook and supporting all this. And you know what's ironic about all this? It is that this generation of Indians has grown up never having to pay a bribe for a telephone. This generation of Indians has grown up never having to pay a bribe to get a scooter out of turn. Now, these may be small examples, but these are everyday examples of corruption that is rooted in the minds of an earlier generation of Indians who used to treat it as completely normal. I mean, you cannot get a phone without bribing. You could not get a scooter without bribing. And you have this large numbers of people outraged at corruption because they haven't had to do that. And I think that's great. I think with the middle class growing and hopefully with more examples of routine corruption that people do not have to engage in anymore, I hope there'll be more outrage about corruption that should not be tolerated. But I thought I should point out that irony. Now, Colonel Rath, you asked something about corruption in politics. Of course, there's huge corruption in politics. I mean, the root cause of all this corruption is because politicians raise enormous sums, a lot for politics, but obviously a lot for their own benefit, not for politics. And I've already addressed that issue in an earlier question when I said that we must have election funding reform. But I think one of the first things we have to deal with in election funding reform is not to be hypocritical. You know, we have a hypocritical mindset that elections should be fought on love and fresh air. That's not true. Elections cost money, and I don't think there should be anything wrong in that. We should reform the system so that the money is transparent and that it is accessible in a way which is not necessarily quid pro quo. What is happening is politicians who get into certain power or position, they use that for rent seeking. You know, MOUs are signed for quid pro quo, for kickbacks. If we can reform political funding, I think it will have a sort of a fundamental effect. I'm not saying politicians will overnight become the cleanest people in society, but I think it would have a huge effect. Yes, there is enormous hypocrisy when politicians swear on oath that they've only spent 25 lakhs or 40 lakhs, whatever is allowed today. That's not reasonable. America may or may not be a good example. There are many other examples. But certainly the American example is anybody who has earned money legitimately is allowed to spend his own billions if he wishes to. There are several billionaires who have tried, have never got elected, but they've wasted millions of dollars of their own money, which they've earned legitimately, paid taxes on it. I think we need to first tackle our hypocritical approach towards political budgets. If we are to think of reforming political funding.
My another question was that how much genuinely you have to spend, you know, to stand for an assembly or genuinely?
I think it differs. I think if you're in Mumbai, you'd have to spend an enormous amount. If you are in rural Odisha, it's much less. I think it varies enormously.
Okay, the lady here, and then Noni, and then I'll come to you. Oh, well, 1, 2, 3, and then there's another one in the back later.
Hi, Jay. It's Amy Kasman from the Financial Times. I wanted to ask you, I mean, in your presentation, you have spoken, you know, over and over about middle-class values as though there was some kind of agreed-upon set of definition of what those values are. I was curious if you might be able to elaborate on that, because I also see a situation in India where, say, lots of people in the, you know, say, greater Delhi area have suddenly prospered on a real estate boom and become very well-to-do and big consumers, but I don't necessarily see that the fundamental values that they had when they were just, you know, Jat farmers has necessarily transformed dramatically. And I wanted to ask you, you know, what are the kind of uniting middle-class values of middle-class India? And when you're taking people who are coming from, you know, very different kinds of socioeconomic settings where the value system may be very different, where are these values actually going to be transmitted from? I mean, you have a situation where lots of people go to engineering school and have no liberal arts education whatsoever. whatever to kind of, you know, change their way of thinking about society. I mean, that's, I guess, what I wanted to ask you, basically.
Ms. Panda, my name is Noni Chawla. I am a management consultant, which basically means I'm unemployed. My question refers to the lowest classes do not have the stamina to fight corruption because they will not get their kerosene or their PDS or whatever it is. So they really do not have the strength to fight corruption. The middle classes find paying the bribes or, you know, whatever it is, because they have the money to spend, they find it convenient, they do not have. So how, you know, from your point of view, where do you see this conspiracy of corruption actually finishing?
First, Amy Casman's question. I think that's a very good question. Although there may not be a uniform definition of what middle class values are, and certainly somebody who struck it overnight rich is not really a definition of middle class if you leave aside that they have money suddenly. Middle class values, I think, generally mean people and families who've struggled, who believe that hard work, decency, honesty pays off. And I think if you look across the country, and I deal with, you know, more than 2 million very poor people, and I see people who are aspirational middle class members, and I see those values. I see the values that they believe in decency, they believe in hard work. They'll take handouts, I mean, it's being given out, why won't they? But they're not looking for a quick buck necessarily. They're looking for education, they're looking for job opportunities for their children. And I think the Jat farmers who've suddenly gone from being marginal farmers to multi-millionaires are not representative of the middle class, except they have money, they have new, you know, SUVs. But I think the large numbers of Indian middle class as well as aspirational middle class have that something undefinable, but I think it is something that we all recognize as what middle class values stand for. So even though we may continue to disagree on what they actually are, I don't think there'll be that great difficulties in those values actually impacting politics. Noni's question, you know, my whole thesis was that the Gilded Age saw enormous corruption. I gave you the example of the cabinet member who was jailed for corruption in 1929. But in the 1870s, in the 1880s, all you have to do is just look it up on Wikipedia, you had enormous scandals. You had something called the Transcontinental Railroad scandal, where shares were given to congressmen at subpar values or at par values, and they were sold to others at much higher rates. Independent commissions of inquiry later on indicted as many as 30 congressmen. My point is, that's what we are going through. We are seeing enormous corruption, and we are seeing enormous economic growth. We have this powerful force that is building up middle class values, if you will, middle class numbers. And if we can actually utilize that for the benefit of the country, as happened in the progressive era in the US, I think we can make these reforms that will have some lasting value. But Noni, I'd like to say something. You talk about industrialists having vested interest. For the first time, we are seeing very powerful people go to jail. This wouldn't have happened 15, 20 years ago. For the first time, we are beginning to see that there is a greater degree of accountability. I hope this will be pushed through to the logical end. I can't guarantee that it will. But there is some hope that's beginning to happen. Now, you said poor people don't have stamina. I disagree completely. I gave you the examples of Odisha and Bihar. Look at what's happened in Tamil Nadu, for instance. Now, they were sought to be bribed with all kinds of goodies. And they said, yeah, we'll take the goodies, but no thank you, we'll still vote you out. Now, it's not that the party that's come into power in Tamil Nadu is known to be non-corrupt. It's just, that's the point I was making also separately, that no national politician or national party has yet jumped on the bandwagon of fundamental reform. What's happened so far is corruption has thrown one set of rascals out, a new set of rascals have come in, and they've made their loot. I think the opportunity exists for some politicians to recognize that, you know, if they don't see it as just their 5 years of opportunity, they can actually have 15 or 20 years of opportunity if they go to the core of the issues. And about middle class paying bribes, I just made the example that middle class hasn't paid a bribe in a generation for a phone or a scooter. Yes, they continue to pay bribes in many, many other routine activities. Hopefully they will keep reducing.
Dr. Panda from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Delhi. India, is there a change? You said yes, and you gave some illustrative indicators that reflected the change. My question is related to rate of change. How can we accelerate rate of change with minimal collateral damage that is intrinsic to change?
Vikram Badshah from RPG. Mr. Panda, I just wanted your views on, I find that there's a lot of cynicism and civil society tends to blame politicians or bureaucrats. Is there not some underlying truth in the fact that we as individuals or an industry are also responsible for encouraging corruption? And should that not be addressed at our level as well?
First, Dr. Pandav's, that's a very hard question for me to answer. How do we optimize the process? You know, I don't have all the answers. You know, it's not that corruption will disappear tomorrow. We are going to get other scandals 10 years from now, 15 years from now. You know, a century after the progressive era, you still have scandals in the US, and you will continue to have. Hopefully, though, that there can be changes in our law, changes in the possible implementation of the law, which will minimize corruption. Now, how do we, you said, how do we do it with minimum collateral damage? I'm not really sure. I just think it's an ongoing process. And in a democracy, you cannot have somebody who can wave a magic wand and the problem will be solved. We will go through more scandals. My hope is that the middle class will not get disenchanted and lose interest. Because if it does, then we are in for a much longer haul. But I'll tell you why I have hope. Somebody mentioned the media a little bit earlier, and you know, we have a very wide range of media, and some very shrill, and some very focused on the immediate issue of the day, not fundamental issues. Many in the media, many of the shrill media are perfectly willing to dump on democracy as a system, rather than on individual bad apples. But if you look again at the end of the 19th century in the US, you had a lot of shrill media doing pretty much the same thing. And yet the situation evolved because, again, I hate to sort of keep repeating on the same issue. I think the increasing numbers of the middle class and their values will have this enormous role. Can our media also have a substantial role in addressing real issues, in focusing on the change that is required rather than just shrill lynch mob mentality? I think it can happen. Mostly you today see this shrill lynch mob mentality, but you do see a few voices of reason, and I hope that the media can continue to play that role. And I'm sorry, Mr. Badshah, I couldn't write down your question. What was it again?
So I just wanted to know whether your views...
Oh, the individuals. I'm sorry, I remember it now. Individual responsibility. I have a view that saying that we all have a responsibility is a pat answer, and that will not solve the problem. Because we all may have a responsibility, but if the system compels us to bribe to get basic requirements. You know, when many people in this room have had to pay a bribe to get a phone connection or a scooter. Now, it's not fair to say, hey, you should have resisted. You should have had individual moral value. I don't think that's fair. I think when you withhold the very basic necessities of life, and then you say, you should have had a higher moral standard, that's not fair. I want to cite something that Kaushik Basu has stated. He's the chief economic advisor to the government. He's written a very controversial piece in an op-ed piece a couple of weeks ago. He said that this whole theme that the bribe giver is equally guilty as the bribe taker is not correct. We should actually exonerate the bribe giver which will enable the bribe giver to then, to file complaints, because to be a whistleblower. You have, again, you have sites coming up like ipaidabbribe.org, and people are citing their examples. Now, if giving a bribe under compulsion is a crime, then you're not going to get any whistleblowing. So my view on individual responsibility is yes, I mean, we should educate our children, and we should have civics classes in school. We should have the liberal arts education given to even engineers that Amy Casman talked about. But I think responsibility should squarely be on rent seekers who misuse office for taking bribes.
That politicians and bureaucrats are to blame?
I'm being asked to move on to many other questions. So
Time, yes. I don't think we have time for supplementaries, because I find that there are at least 4 people more who want to ask questions. So 1, 2, 3, and 4.
May I?
Yeah.
Sunil Mehta. Jay, actually I want to refer to your joke about politicians. If I would be farmer at that site, I would have definitely saved you. Because we need the politicians like you. My question is that, you know, we talked about science, technology, and several other factors, you know, change, you know, making factors. How about the role of innovation? And as I understand, at that time, innovation based on the number of patents filed at that era were very high. They went very high at that time. So not only about what is the status now, what is the government policy? How does an average Indian look at the innovation? Or we are just saying, okay, copy something, what Americans or, you know, other innovators have done it. Thank you.
Myself, in Devar Goodwill, I am from Supreme Court. Internal democracy is very crucial, but how can it be achieved? Is it practical to achieve it in this age? Second question is, the middle class is gradually becoming center of attraction in Indian polity, but what will be its impact in progress? And third question is this: in democracy, politicians have made politics a business. How to stop it?
Okay, we'll take these 2, Jay, and then 2 more, and then we'll close because we're running out of time.
I think innovation is important in one very critical way that affects politics. If we have a belief system in the country that it's not just wheeling dealing in land that can make you a millionaire, but that you can create wealth from ideas and hard work. I think some aspect of this has been contributed by the IT revolution in India. And the IT revolution didn't happen because of government, it happened in spite of government. The government focused on industries like steel and killed it until again economic reform began to take place. I agree with you that innovation has an impact going far beyond the economic benefits, and that it helps. If you have a large number of innovators that are successful in the country, then you have a belief system that takes place. You have an ecosystem, if you will. So how do we help that? You know, again, it all goes down to how do we evolve the right policies. It goes down to our democratic systems. We remove the grip of political oligarchies and have a more transparent debate in the country. Internal democracy, how to achieve. Why don't you, sir, get involved and organize an email campaign and flood the election commissioner with 10 million emails to just do his job on this aspect. He does a great job. I mean, they all do. The election commissioners do a great job in conducting the real elections. But to take on this issue, which is well within their purview, all I think they need to have is be flooded with emails from, I think 10 million emails would do it.
Okay, last 2 questions. Didi here and then at the back.
My name is Nilima Chawla. I'm delighted to hear you say the last thing that you just mentioned, which is flood so-and-so with 10 million emails. Because my question really is, what is it that can practically be done by the middle class? We've seen the apathy, we've seen the cynicism, we've seen the contempt for politicians, we've seen now the glimmerings, whether it was Jessica Lal, whether it was Anna Hazare's campaign, of some involvement. But I think there is always this question of, yes, but is it going to work? What is it that we can do that's both practical and efficient and effective? And I think something like this that you've talked about, what I would like to find out from you is, what would you suggest that can be done by individuals like yourself, maybe organizations, to educate people on how to get involved? Because to me that is really the big question. It's not that we've been a nation of talkers, the middle classes have always been involved at that level, but not at the level of action. So suggestions on what can be done, an education, an institutional framework which allows people to get involved.
And the gentleman in the back, last row.
Good evening, everybody. My name is R.K. Gupta. My question pertains to land acquisition as such, taking cue from Singur to what is happening in Greater Noida, where one or the other political party would pitch in to take advantage of the situation. Will it be possible for all members of parliament to come together and draft or enact a land acquisition law which would be transparent, non-litigation, remunerative for all kind of farmers, to avoid such kind of situations to happen again and again, and maybe at the risk of losing their party as such?
First, Ms. Chalo, about what specifically can be done. There are quite a few things that can be specifically done. This Anna Hazare campaign wouldn't have mattered if the middle class didn't get involved. It was attempted by some of the same people except him a few months earlier. Didn't get traction. It got traction because of people like you. It got traction because of the people who turned up at Jantar Mantar and the people who did their Facebook and Twitter things. There are several such things that can be done. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that there are some organizations that are beginning to work on political reform. This was an issue of political reform, of having a Lokpal. One example, I think I've talked about some very fundamental changes that are required, and then some policy level changes, like you talked about how do we manage the deficit. So I think we need to tackle the fundamental issues first, and policies will evolve as they will. I think, in my opinion, one of the very fundamental changes that is required is that we have a very inefficient justice system. First of all, to begin with, we have a far smaller number of judges compared to the population. The developed countries all have somewhere in the range of 100 judges per million population. We have something like 13. And you know what? We have something like 30–40% vacancies out of that. So there are proposals pending to have a judicial commission, to have a system that involves a more transparent appointment system for judges. What we have today is a closed system, which is not correct, and the numbers itself are not correct. We need to have vastly larger number of judges with some kind of checks and balances, some ombudsman system for the judicial system. This could be a cause that could be taken up by people. If enough number of middle class people treat it as a hobby, to spend 1 hour a week on their issue of choice, I think we could make things happen on some of these fronts. Very last question on land acquisition. Can there be a consensus in Parliament? I'm beginning to think that there can. This issue has been going on. I've been writing about it for about 6 years, and it's been very contentious. We have 19th century laws that are being misused, that are unfair to certain sections. You have extreme views. You have views on one end of the scale which says that suppose 10,000 acres is to be acquired and even 20 families oppose, even if thousands of families agree, then the 20 families should have a veto power. That could be one extreme view that may not be practical. We need to find views that serve the greatest good for the greatest number. And we have to have an equitable way for those who are going to be disenfranchised by land acquisition. But I think this has been so much in the public domain that nothing can get through without a real sort of volatile debate. And I understand that the draft bill is being worked on by this government and that it is expected to come up sometime soon. Because if it doesn't, a large number of investments are held up. There are people that actually, I'll tell you what has been happening in Odisha, for instance. You've heard about the POSCO project. There are anti-POSCO people. There are also pro-POSCO people. And these pro-POSCO people have been writing to the environment minister for the last 2 weeks that we want to give our land, but not exactly on these terms. We want these slightly other terms. And all these views should be taken into account. So your question was, can there be consensus in Parliament? I think there will be quite a volatile debate. You will probably have a few shutdowns of Parliament, but I think we can probably achieve something that can be passed.
Okay, we've done, I think, done better than we do in question in Parliament. I was just checking, 1/3 of the people present have been able to ask a question in 45 minutes, or well, 55 minutes. We're about 3 minutes over. The program gives me 5 minutes for closing remarks. I'll just take 2 or 3 and test your patience, and we'll close after that. And if Jay wants to come back on some of the stuff I'm saying, then, you know, you have that privilege. But I just want to leave the thought that we should not automatically assume that the middle class is better than whatever other classes you want to define them as, poor, rich, whatever. If you look at Delhi and if you look at the pattern of electricity theft, and this is well documented, the maximum theft is not in the poor colonies, but in the affluent colonies where people with multiple air conditioners are actually stealing electricity because they don't want to pay the electricity bill, which is one example. The second is that, to give an example, cooking gas, which is essentially a middle class cooking medium because the poor use firewood or they use kerosene because they can't afford to put the money into gas stoves and put the deposits on cylinders. You can get a massive subsidy going, but there's huge protest if you say you pay the going rate on what it costs to produce a cylinder of gas. And we've seen in Brazil, where you had a very strong middle class essentially grab whatever public resources there were and deny them to the poor, even in terms of financial handouts. You see it in the US, where the politicians only talk of the middle class. They never talk about the poor. And you said that the poor don't vote. They don't see a stake in the system. So the question that comes to my mind is that if you're putting this much hope on the middle class being the solution, can they become a problem in the sense of expropriating the resources that are publicly available and effectively keeping them away from the poor? And do we need to be wary of this as an automatic solution to many of the problems in moving away from what you wrote in your article in the Times of India, away from identity politics to service delivery model where politicians actually serve consumers and citizens? Which is one thought. The second one, I don't know if you want to comment on this, is when we're seeing signs of hopeful change at many levels, and people sort of talk disparagingly about politicians, it always, I somehow can't put that in the context of an election in which you have 84% of the electorate voting. Now, that kind of belief in representative democracy is unusual in most societies. So, this society has committed itself in a way to representative politics to a level which most societies have not, and I think the poor see a stake in the game, in this particular game, which they don't probably see in other aspects of the national game. So, are we missing something there? And finally, when you see at the end of the latest state election results that 38% of the Trinamool candidates have a criminal record. And the AIDMK government in Tamil Nadu starts with saying 35 kilograms of rice for every poor family free. And you wonder what distortion does that create in the agricultural market, and if every farmer now says, why the hell should I take the trouble to grow the damn rice, they're going to give it to me free. Are you seeing necessarily that we are actually moving in the right direction, or do we still have serious issues that we need to be worrying about? These are just some closing thoughts. You can comment on them if you wish to, and then we'll close.
I'll just take a minute. I think you've raised some very valid concerns. I don't want to give the impression that the rising middle class is a panacea for all our ills. I think that it's a powerful force that can be guided in the right direction. The middle class in Delhi steals power because they can, because that's the way it's always been. I think it can change. I think if you start name and shame campaigns today, will have much greater effectiveness than it would have had 20 years ago, when the act of getting a legal electricity connection was quite complicated. Everybody tolerated and condoned stealing. But yeah, I agree that there is a danger that the middle class can appropriate for itself a lot of things. Now, I think you mentioned 84% voter turnout. Let me just give you an example. Late 19th century voter turnout in the US was 90%. And it was based on the spoils system. The Tammany Hall bosses and the party bosses went to enormous trouble to mobilize the vote and apportion the benefits to only their voters. And that's what you are seeing. I think we should take lessons from history that all these ills do have remedies. We just have to know what has happened and what remedies can be tried. Thanks.
Okay, that brings us to the end of this session. I must thank Jay for, yes, I think a round of applause is certainly well merited for being perceptive, thoughtful, honest, and engaged with a lot of issues on which he was thrown a whole variety of questions at him, and you saw the responses that he gave. So he's clearly somebody who's thinking about a lot of these issues, and I think we're happy to see somebody like him move into the mainstream of Indian politics and make a difference. Thank you also for your being here on behalf of Aspen, which is organizers. For your being here, for your presence, for your attention, for your engagement with the issues. And if civil society is to make a difference, then it is this kind of engagement that will make a difference to the direction in which our country moves. Thank you once again, everyone, and have a pleasant evening.